Hi.
Hello.
How about this book, y'all? So this is only going to feel redundant to Reniqua, who I interviewed this morning for my for my on-air WNYC weekly show Rebel. But it's a very short show, so we're going to sort of expand, because we had sort of just gotten rolling when we had to cut it short. But I want to start because, book titles are, I'm working on a memoir called Surviving the White Gaze. Do with that what you will. But, but yours, it's pure gold for those who get it, right? But for those who don't get the reference, tell us what it's about and how you came to choose it.
So for those of you who don't know, it's from a Notorious B.I.G., a great, amazing rapper from Brooklyn. He has a song called Juicy, and it starts out, it was all a dream, and it's I
used to read Word Up magazine.
Yeah, and it's sort of him about his kind of rags to riches tale from Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn to becoming a rapper with tons of money. And it really made sense for me because when I was growing up, I realized rappers were it wasn't a new thing. I mean, I'm a very old millennial, but
girl.
rap wasn't a new thing, and it was like these rappers' dreams were becoming realized. You saw Jay-Z and Biggie, and they were flaunting money and cash, and it felt like dreaming was possible. It felt there was possibility in the air. And now, as I've come of age, and now I'm not so sure about that. It doesn't feel like the possibility is quite there.
I love that notion of possibility as being the dream for us, for Black folks. Possibility as opposed to hope. And I think that one of the really interesting things about the quote-unquote American dream is that, it was kind of established at a really horrible time for certainly Black folks and anybody who is non-white. And so it's interesting that we still gravitate towards it and look at it in some ways through a unified lens, but that there are very specific things about it that speak to Black folks. Can you address that?
Yeah, I've been kind of grappling with it as I was doing interviews for this book, trying to figure out why it is that Black people are so hopeful, and particularly Black millennials, right? There are several studies that show that Black millennials actually believe in the American dream more than any other group. It's kind of amazing. White millennials actually believe in it the least, even though they are the ones who actually think they've achieved it the most. But Black millennials, yeah.
But wouldn't you also say just that whole cavalier attitude? Mm-hmm. I mean, what is the phrase? Give me the confidence of the average white man, right? But that the American dream, whatever, I mean, I think there is that kind of Absolutely. Cavalier kind of confidence and kind of a take it or leave it privilege,
right? Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
But that for Black folks and Black millennials, and I also want to hear from you about how you think some of the goals or perceptions of the American dream have linked through or coursed through generations of Black people.
Right. I mean, I think that Black people, Black millennials too, we need hope. We have to have that opportunity because America's pretty shitty to us. And if we don't have that, you're right. I think white men don't have to have that in the same way. And you look at it and through time. I'm also a PhD student, right? And I'm starting to work on my dissertation, which is about the American dream, but it looks at Black culture and how it's engaged with the American dream over time. And you see it. I mean, it's so prevalent in Black culture, hope and opportunity over and over again, whether it's the Great Migration, where you can move up, or the Civil Rights Movement. You see this theme, and of course, Barack Obama, just a few years ago, you see this theme, I think, of hope and optimism. And that thread is consistently there throughout, generations.
It sometimes makes me think that whoever that white fellow was who coined the American dream,
James Truslow Adams,
right, was actually looking toward Black folks, right? Because, even in these most monstrous devastating, dehumanizing situations, you know, there was always music, there was always joy, there was always love, and there was always hope.
Right, absolutely.
And so I sort of feel like, I mean, that kind of, it stands to reason, since pretty much everything in America was taken from black folks, but whatever. but do you know what I'm saying? It's
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
you know, maybe that's the reason that there is such a connection or kinship for black folks to the American dream, because it's actually ours, belong to us to begin with.
Yeah, that you can come through nothing, the idea, you know, and still have opportunity despite your background, absolutely. And I think it speaks to black Americans and black audiences, and you see it.
Yeah.
But it's so hard. Like, I feel like it's been harder and harder to actually obtain.
Yeah. Do you think that there are, I mean, so sort of back to the idea of millennials, which are discussed and talked about quite a lot. Millennials are broke. Millennials are burnt out. Millennials are this. You know, they're the largest living and most diverse generation, so on and so forth. And yet there's so little about the sort of stark differences between, specifically, black millennials and white millennials. I had to read 3 times over the anecdote, or the part of the book where Reniqua was talking to a black man about this book, interviewing him, and he gets pulled over by the police while they're on the phone. I mean, as a rule, white millennials don't really have to worry about that. And he went through this whole chain of events, right? And it wasn't even the threat of violence, but what if I get a ticket? How am I going to pay for that? What? I take the time off from work to go down to the city hall, or so on and so forth. Were there other instances in the book and your research and subjects where that really came through pointedly?
You mean the
stark difference.
The stark differences at every point. Like, I mean, it didn't matter if I was talking to sex workers who said that they did not get the same amount of money. They couldn't charge the same amount because of their skin color. Or people in corporate America who said, I can't dress like Mark Zuckerberg, like, and actually, you know, go in and get a job and at least be respected. It was across the board where there were just such stark differences. I mean, honestly, like, by the end of it, I was sick of hearing, like, you know, the idea of we have to work twice as hard.
Right.
And it was like just a frustrating thing. I was like, I'm tired of writing this. Like, I don't want to like actually keep writing this. Like, but I mean, across the board, everyone said that their experiences, they either had to work harder, they had to work their networks better. It all kind of points to life that they were not given the same opportunity, chances. They didn't have the same fallbacks. It was really depressing, actually.
I mean, so for you and for me and for those of us who write about these issues, you know, there are days when it's just like, I'm tired of writing this. Tired of saying this, I'm tired of explaining this. And then as I was reading your book, I was thinking, maybe that's the point, is that we have to just keep saying it, and that we have to come to a place where we are somehow comfortable with continuing to say it. Right. And I don't know what that looks like, but I do think that, you know, for a lot of white millennials to hear the fact that even if we do it twice as good, it doesn't matter. You're still going to get it and we're not. Or you're still going to get it and we're going to have some kind of repercussion. So when you were writing this and researching this and you got tired of hearing this, I mean, what kind of process did you go through in terms of, this is important, I need to get this out there?
What kind of process? I mean, you know, the thing was that I would have these interviews that I would intend on being like an hour long or 45 minutes even. They would end up going on for hours and hours and hours, particularly with black women. And I realized how much people, they just didn't get their stories out there. No one was listening to them. No one understood their plight. They wanted someone to talk to them. I mean, over and over again, I heard stories about depression. I'm not sure how much that comes across in the book. But I mean, at the end of it, people wanting to commit suicide, anxiety. I mean, I was not asking about this. And over and over again, I heard these stories. And it did make me think that someone needs to tell their story. These are important stories. This is only a tiny, tiny, tiny slice of the millennial population, but it's important. So that's kind of what kept me going.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I'm not a millennial, but I was reading a part of the book where you're talking about getting a job that you had been looking forward to, and you know, this had been a goal for you, and you were there, and then you started having panic attacks. and then you went to a shrink and you were prescribed Xanax. Literally the exact same thing happened to me. And I'm thinking, like, is this what we have to do? Like, to be okay in the workforce? Do we have to be prescribed Xanax? Like, I mean, what is that? Right. And how do we address that? And it's like, you know, and I remember this psychiatrist is saying, well, you just take half a Xanax, you'll be fine. I'm like, I don't want to take a Xanax to go to work.
Right.
I don't want to.
Yeah, but you have to prove yourself like so much harder than, you know.
But yes, exactly. And I also had to feel like this, you know, the white people who were in power, you know, like would see what I was doing beyond the perception. I mean, this sounds so pedestrian, but it, you know, every time you say it, you sort of feel like anew, like, wow, I'm really just hearing this. I'm really just getting this, which goes back to the idea of saying it over and over, because I do think that we hear it anew at different points.
Absolutely.
What were some of the other, you know, you address a great broad range of things, you know, Black love and working class, and I love the whole kind of your perception of working class and your attitude and your kind of like, you know, prejudice.
Oh, my
right?
college, yes.
Yeah. And how we manage that as a folk, as a people. Right? Can you talk a little bit about that particular subject?
Yeah. So there's a section of my book where I talk about this great guy who's wonderful. And we started dating, and he was taking a break off from college. And he walked into my dorm room. I was at college at American University in D.C., you know, thinking I am kind of living the American dream and being upwardly mobile and, you know, happy to be in school and, right, like doing my thing. And he comes in his factory outfit. You know, he was working on a line.
It's not an outfit.
A onesie. The onesie.
It's a uniform. But that just reminds me that my husband and son watch the NFL, and I always call the uniforms outfits.
Yeah, no, I feel like it, you know, it had an aesthetic. You know, he had like the Timberlands, and
it's a look.
It was a total look.
Yeah.
Which, you know, I'm not sure if this made it into the book. I can't remember, but one of my white colleagues thought it was a very sexy look. Or, you know, classmates, which was interesting. But my reaction, there's lots of things going on with that young lady. Yeah, she thought it was very hot. But I kind of recoiled and was like, oh my gosh, like what? This is not cool. And it kind of reminded me of the things that I was supposed to be moving up from, right? Like his outfit was a reminder of his working class status and like super bougie. Like it was just. Like that's on me. Like it was like I was like, oh, like, you know, he's here around all these like white folks in my school, and like I'm dating this guy, and I think I said, you know, it was my bougie blinders at the time of what success is supposed to look like. And for me at the time, success was supposed to look like, you know, dating somebody at least who was on my level, which doesn't mean anything because he was probably actually making more than me and, you know, perfectly happy at his job and doing wonderful things. But success in my eyes at the time didn't look like that. It looked like Blair Underwood. It looked like, you know, someone in a 3-piece suit.
Which listen, girl, is not so bad. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think that one of the many really traumatizing and unfortunate, devastating things about racism is that it turns us against each other. Absolutely. And we end up internalizing what white folks see. And then we judge ourselves even, you know, like, so you've had this experience, you've described this anecdote, and then I can hear in your voice where you're like, that was my own bougie thing. What I wanted was Blair Underwood. You can want that without feeling badly.
Right, but I did not want to discount that experience of the working class, which I think that I do hear, you know, people do, and other young Black people, you know, and I think that is a valid experience, and we also need to have like this kind of intersectional lens where we're looking at race and class and privilege. And so it's a good reminder for me sometimes, like of my blind spots. And I wanted to be really honest about what my American dream looked like and kind of, you know, the problems. Like I'm problematic too. I didn't want to just put it on other people or just white folk or society. So I'm, you know,
and then it gets so much more complicated because we don't get to be problematic. right? I mean, you and I can be problematic with each other right here, and y'all are peace, and but being problematic in mainstream spaces, is, can be potentially life-changing.
Absolutely. And I mean, that is something that I think I also took away from writing it. Like, there was so much of a pressure on young Black people to do everything perfectly, to say everything the right way. And this goes from, activists to the drug dealers. Like, you had to be and think a certain way. And I wanted to really push back on that, because I feel like we have no fucking clue, like, what we're doing. And I wanted to be to give the people in my book, to give the characters the space to do that. Like, there are problematic statements, there are contradictions, and I wanted to leave those things in my story and other people's stories. Like, I think particularly with white folks, they're allowed to be complicated. Like, think about how many anti-heroes we have. Like, there's like Tony Soprano, or the guy on Breaking Bad, or, but so often Black people, and particularly young Black people, like, aren't given that opportunity. And you think about someone like Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, they weren't given the space to have any flaws, like, on their record. They couldn't be smoking weed or having weed, or, they couldn't have, Trayvon Martin had, like, a picture of himself as, like, a gang member. Like, they get criticized for that. And for us, while some of it is, like, kind of amusing, like, what I think is my bouginess, but I mean, it means it's life or death for some of these young men and women out here. So it's an important thing. Right,
which is what I was sort of trying to say about it sort of turning us against each other, but also internalizing this lens or this idea, like Mike Brown and Trayvon and Laquan and so many, and Tamir, these were young boys whose lives were just taken. I mean, that, I think, is just the first point that we have to be able to establish, and we're not even there. We're not even there. And so for us then to reflect on our own kind of perceptions of us not as a tribe, but as a family, as a culture or whatnot, we have to kind of wind in and out in a way that others don't. And that brings me sort of to this idea, recently, I don't know how many of y'all are on social media or Twitter, but there was a piece in BuzzFeed recently about millennial burnout, and it's BuzzFeed, so it's going to go viral. And, a Black woman, a young Black woman who I follow, who just did this long thread of like, I saw this headline and I was like, yeah, someone's going to talk about burnout. And I read the whole thing and it was all about white millennials, because it's like millennials are white, right? And so, and you talk about this a little bit in the book. Why are Black millennials so invisible?
Yeah, millennials of color. I mean, like, something like 44% of millennials are millennials of color. Like, I think the largest is Latino millennials, followed by African Americans, and then Asians. But I mean, we're a huge part of the millennial population. It's insane, like, how little people actually know about us and why we're so invisible. I mean, we're invisible everywhere. We're invisible. I think I said this earlier, like on your show, like, we're kind of seen but not seen, or seen but not heard.
Hyper seen.
Yeah, but not really understood. Like,
the veil.
We're in some ways people see us, but like, who really is sitting down to understand us?
So that's the thing that makes me think about generations and questions about generations, right? Like I just said the veil, I'm referencing W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about living behind the veil, being two souls in one dark body. This is a guy who wrote this, in 1920? 1903, right. And so in so many ways, we carry these same things through generation from generation in such a kind of unique way. So what a challenge, and I think you have approached it really beautifully, to take on this largest living, most diverse generation in the country, and to sort of look at and point out and isolate ways in which it's really different for Black folks.
Right. And I mean, the thing that I think people tend to ask is like, well, okay, how are these problems different from the problems that Black people have had for generations, right? Like, what makes this group of Black people unique? And the thing that I keep coming back to, and the thing that that just is part of my experience the most is that we were told that these dreams could happen. We didn't grow up, right, during segregation. We grew up when Jesse Jackson was president. There was this idea of hope and change. There were lots of black mayors. There were a couple of governors, maybe not that many, but we were in politics. My parents, our parents, were the first generation to really kind of benefit from civil rights legislation of the 60s, affirmative action. It looked like there was opportunity. Oprah was coming out. There was a rap category added to the Grammy Awards. The Grammys are very problematic today.
Yeah, everybody's problematic. But
it looked like things were better. We were told you can do anything you want to do if you work hard. And I think for this generation, it felt like that was possible, at least for me, growing up. Now, there were some problems. There was like Rodney King. Even in my community in New Jersey, there was a young man named Philip Pennell that got killed. I mean, there were problems, but it felt like these dreams were just ours for the taking, right? And then when I came of age, there was Barack Obama. But then, look at the things that happened during his presidency and now, especially after. Look at what's happening right now.
Which is a direct backlash.
A total backlash.
Yeah.
And I think that's a frustrating place to be in. For this generation to see that, wow, a black man could be, elected president, but, in the same time, every second being questioned, even if he's from this country. And now that man actually got elected, president. So I think it's a different space than previous generations, but the same in some ways. We're supposed to be woke. We have interracial partners, like my lovely fiance. But it doesn't matter that. But that we have interracial friends. Like I grew up in a pretty diverse school. But it doesn't matter in some ways. It doesn't mean that we're understanding race any better. I mean, you look at some statistics about this woke generation and something like 35% of millennials thinks blacks are just as lazy or lazy or not as intelligent or less motivated. And those numbers are barely different than their counterparts. So yeah, there's been some progress, but there's a lot of work to do.
And that sort of phrase, right? Yes, there's been some progress, but there's a lot of work. I feel like we say that pretty much every decade when it's a marker, right? Because there's so much to be undone. There's so much damage to be undone. The entire country was founded. The artery of this country is about this sort of construct of race and racism, and I think it's also, as a non-millennial, but as a parent to a teenager, a young teenager, it's sort of like I don't want to say to him, you can be anything you want to be. Because I think that you all got sold out a little bit. You can be everything you want to be. Who runs the world? Girls. Not so much. Right? I love the sentiment. The sentiment and the intention is to empower, but the reality is starkly different, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you look at so many measures, and black millennials are so far behind their white and then sometimes Asian and sometimes Latino, counterparts, these indicators for upward mobility, for whatever. You take upward mobility to mean different things. It means different things to different people. But if you look at these kind of traditional markers of success, home ownership, student debt, so far behind. Marriage, we're wealth is a huge one. We are far below where we should be.
Where we should be.
Where we should be.
So where should we be?
We've been here for 400 years.
So where should we be?
We should be. For example, the home ownership rate in black communities is the same as it was, during the, when segregation was legal.
Say that to the audience.
The home ownership rate is the same as it was when segregation was legal. I feel like that is unacceptable.
It's totally unacceptable, and it's also just a little bit, even for those of us who look at these stats every day, what? Yeah. What?
It's kind of unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
So that brings me then to the question of this book, which is, fearlessly and beautifully researched, and the reporting is beautiful, and I love how you wove your own, experience into it. Is this book for your peers Is it for Black millennials? Is it for white millennials? Is it for all of us? What is the message? What is the hope that comes through here?
For me, it is for Black millennials. I mean, or young Black people in America. I shouldn't just say, and maybe for like, my mom and her generation to also understand us, because I think there's a lot of older Black people who don't understand the experience of a young Black people. That were like, pull up your pants and be happy that you got an education. I couldn't do that. So I think some of it's for that generation as well. But I think this is, I want everyone to read it. I mean, I look at this room, like I want it to be, a diverse read. I want people to understand that, like, millennials aren't just Lena Dunham. I use her a lot. I know.
I
cannot. That's what I feel like the media uses. So,
That's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah,
but yeah.
But I do want the experience to be. I want people to understand what this young group is going through, and kind of beyond like just the conversation of Black Lives Matter, which kind of is not so vibrant.
Which,
even
just
when
to
I
say again, when I said tell the audience about the home ownership. Hi, Black Lives Matter. Really?
Yeah,
We're still saying that?
We had
okay.
to say that. Like,
Yeah.
for our generation, I said that. Like, we had to tell that to the world. Like, so when people are saying, like, well, how are you different from, like, white millennials? Like, you guys didn't have to, like, remind the world that, like, over and over again.
Not just remind, inform.
Yeah. And people still don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's Nancy Pelosi recently, who kind of did the All Lives Matter thing. But, like, what that does to your soul, your humanity, your sense of self is different, I think, than other groups, and even sometimes other groups of color.
Yeah.
Have to deal with that is hard on you, and so I understand why people are frustrated and have anxiety and worry. Like when over and over again, people say like I just am tired of having to prove myself. And I feel like we have to do that. We like still have to prove ourselves to the world. I'm sorry, I did not answer your question at all.
No, that's
but
totally
I forgot
fine.
what it was.
That's totally fine, because we're going to ask for a couple of questions here. 2 or 3 questions. We've got one down here. Yep. I think we've got a mic.
Yeah. Could you use this mic if you don't mind?
Oh, sure. I think I heard you reference E.B. Du Bois before, and to reference briefly Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in America. I think it was printed in the 50s. It's
Can you all hear him? Is it on? Here, you want mine? Okay.
Is it on? A reference to E.B. Du Bois and Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in America, which, as I read it a long time ago, vaguely retrospectively understand it, it linked it historically successfully with anti-Semitism. However, the question is, even as a white guy, I kind of knew in the Midwest that I had to shield that I was wanted to be like Albert Camus or Simone de Beauvoir or something, I wanted to grow up and be an intellectual. How is it different for someone who is presumably an autodidact, because you started kind of on your own with your teachers and you kept going and you were relentless? I was reading some of your prose. For the African American experience as intellectuals.
How? Could you tell me?
Could you say what it was like for you to
pursue being intellectual?
Yeah, I mean, not as some kind of,
I think that's
leather
just the Black
elbows.
experience in America, to be honest. I mean, I think definitions of intellectualism are different. Like, because I feel like, my great aunt Dee dropped a lot of knowledge, and she has a high school degree. I think that what it's like to be an intellectual. I mean,
Or the pursuit.
Or the pursuit of
Yeah.
it. I think for me, it's
Could I briefly amend it? It's not as an intellectual, and quote unquote, it's really caring and then getting reproached for it, or not being able to be believed that when you're articulate and you're precise.
I mean, I would say that from a very early age, despite the fact that I was adopted into a white family, my teachers underestimated me and did not expect for me to be bright, and did not expect for me to be articulate or curious. And I sort of leaned into that. Like, I didn't feel like I wanted to put forth an effort because the expectations were so low. And, you know, it wasn't until I sort of, I guess, got tired of feeling that way when I got to college, and I realized that there was a bigger world. I mean, that's a real argument for college, that I could get out there and actually say what I wanted to say. But I do remember feeling very underestimated, and that was not something, that being smart was not something I could do.
I agree. I mean, basically, you know, the exact same experience. I feel underestimated all the time. When I did have markers of achievement, it was like, oh, that's affirmative action at play. And I feel that you are not allowed to be intellectually curious, and you have to really push back on it. And I'm not sure what actually drove you. What drove me was, you know, I think this, you know, desire to just learn and to have knowledge and to kind of push back against folks. But I think it takes a very, very long time to do. I was far into my adulthood.
Oh,
like,
for sure.
To have that confidence kind of broken from an early age.
Yeah.
Because I think I was, and tell me about you, like, I mean, I think I was like, you know, I was very confident until about like 4th grade.
It's funny you should say that. It's funny you should say that, because for me it was a combination of things. So my 5th grade teacher told me that I was very pretty for a black girl. She said, most black girls are very ugly. And she made a face when she told me. And but right up until that point, I was just a badass. I was like, whatever, this is great. And then I started to think, well, if I'm only just so pretty, because that's, of course, what was important, then I'm going to figure out if I can be smart in some way. And so then I started to think about being smart, and then I got all this pushback, and I was like, well, this blows. Like, it's all about navigating your way, and it's not uncommon in terms of being a teenager or a high school or whatnot. But I will say that when I finally figured it out, when I read Zora Neale Hurston, and Tony, and then I just immediately felt kindred. I felt like I could make a voice.
For me, it was Baldwin.
Yeah.
Yeah, who's very masculine now that I read him now, but
Yeah.
when I was younger, it was Baldwin who I like really connected to as like outsider, and you know.
But he's such a powerful, yeah.
Yeah.
Another question in the back here.
Sir. Thank you. Bert?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Right, so you talked a little bit about how the American dream has been so pervasive despite the fact that it's fairly unachievable for a lot of people of color. And you mentioned how that might be because there's this kind of reoccurring, you know, need and theme of hope and opportunity and change. But I was also wondering if you could kind of speak to maybe the role that technology has also had on that pervasiveness of the American dream, especially for millennials who, you know, grew up with technology booming. And I'm just wondering if you think, has technology kind of changed the myth of the American dream, or has it just kind of intensified it because you can see, you know, on Instagram people achieving things, or, you know, are we more honest on our social media? Thank you.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, for millennials, you know, a lot of them grew up with social media. Most of us grew up with social media. And I think, and people constantly told me this, that, you know, they see success, right? You see this very curated image of success and how your lives should be on social media. And that was a burden to them, right? Like, they felt like they had to live up to this particular standard that was so unachievable. And I think it seems like now people are realizing how curated that is, how false that is, but it was particularly hard, and particularly for Black millennials, who I'm sure you guys all have heard about Black Twitter. Social media, I think, has been a particularly strong force for them. I think partially because our voices are so invisible in other spaces. But I think there's some pushback on that now. Rebecca, I know like this is kind of your area as well. But there was some real frustration with the power of, you know, social media, but then people really questioned it. And I think they're really skeptical about it, but still really embrace it. I think there was like an ambivalence about, at least for the millennials that I talk to, about social media.
So, I mean, I think that you would be the authority on the Black millennials. I mean, as a non-Black millennial who's very active on social media and who has mentored a lot of young Black women specifically who are on social media, I have found it to be a very important and significant platform for Black women's voices, for all Black women particular for all of those reasons that we just talked about. But then, of course, it's also another medium that has been pilfered, and quotes are used, and language is used and stolen. Every single vernacular term that you hear, from bae to woke to on fleek. These were all terms that came through social media, mostly young black folks who created these terms, and then they're just part of the parlance without any kind of recognition or credit. So I mean, there are very problematic aspects of social media for black folks, black millennials, and not millennials and not. But for my piece, I think, and as a parent as well, as a boy who's sort of interested in social media but not super interested, technology is growing faster than our brains. It's growing faster than we're able to keep up with. And so I do think on a survival level, we do have to be engaged to a certain extent. How that changes the American dream is a really great question. And I hope that the engagement that social media has produced or will in some way change the American dream. I mean, from the marches to the hashtags, to the movements that aren't moments, that may very well change the future.
But I think it's also been, particularly in these last few years, a very unsafe space for certain people. And
sure.
As you said, the
For
language
sure.
and like people feel entitled to say things to black folks. So I think that's still, and I think that has broken a lot of young people or turned them off about, the power of social media. So while I do think it is a place for potential dreams or for people to see dreams, I think it's also crushing those dreams, like at the same time in some ways, because it's such an unsafe territory in some ways.
In some ways it is, but I also think that the support system is very, very strong. I mean, any of us who write about race or feminism or any of that stuff are attacked daily, ritually. But that there are people who will come and say, we got you, and we're going to block, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think it's unsafe, but I also think we've seen a lot worse.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We still here.
See what
We
happened
got
with
you.
R. Kelly.
For sure. Yeah.
It is.
So I'm going to invite you to stay around and ask questions and sign books. I'm sure she's going to sign some books, right? And thank you so much for coming out.
Yeah, thank
This
you.
was great. Appreciate you. Appreciate you.